My name is Lowell Sandell. I'm Field Market Development in the Western Corn Belt for Valent USA. And today we're here at the Valent Learning Center at the 2021 Commodity Classic, and we're really happy that you could join us. We're going to talk about management of resistant weeds in soybeans. And, this is a topic that gets a lot of attention, but even though we have new traits and new technologies coming, there are general principles that we need to adhere to keep those new traits and technologies viable and useful to the grower as long as possible. And we're going to dive into that here today. But first up, we have comments from some of the university experts in weed management or row crop weed management, just to give their thoughts on the importance of resistance management in today's soybean production systems. We have Dr. Aaron Hager from the University of Illinois, then Dr. Kevin Bradley from the University of Missouri, and Dr. Brian Young from Purdue University. And each one is going to give comments on ways to mitigate or prevent further development of resistant weed populations in their states and from their perspective.
My name is Aaron Hager, and I'm the Extension Weed Scientist here at the University of Illinois. Now, I know many of you are making some final decisions or perhaps minor adjustments to your 2021 soybean herbicide weed control program, and that for some of us, that's just going to be beginning here in just a few weeks. But as I look back in time, 2008 was the first season that the weed science program here at the University of Illinois made very specific recommendations for the management of glyphosate-resistant water hemp in soybean. At the time, many people really didn't realize that the recommendations took into account not only glyphosate resistance, but also the rapidly increasing frequency of resistance to many other herbicide and herbicide classes, in particular the PPO inhibiting products. Now, our recommendations at the time included 5 steps, the first of which was to include a full labeled rate of an effective soil residual herbicide. And folks, that recommendation continues to this day. Using effective residual herbicides allows the soybean crop to become established without interference from competing weed species. We always stress that the most competitive weed is not the weed that emerges 4 to 5 weeks after the soybeans emerge. The most competitive weeds are those that emerge along with the soybean. Now, quite simply, weeds compete for the same resources as the crop, and any of these resources used by the weed ultimately are not available to the crop. So your investment, the capital, the money that you invest in your weed management program is really an investment to allow that soybean crop to express its maximum genetic yield potential. Now, without a doubt, the continued evolution of weed populations resistant to herbicides is one of the most significant challenges facing soybean producers today. We're learning more and more about what we sometimes refer to as this new era of herbicide resistance. And what we've learned so far is that we simply cannot solve a herbicide-generated problem with herbicides. This non-target site, or more accurately, this metabolic herbicide resistance, will bring even more challenges to our soybean weed management systems in the years ahead. Now, don't get me wrong, we will continue to use herbicides and still recommend beginning the growing season with effective soil residual products. But we also strongly believe that using additional tools to ensure that no weed seed returns at the end of the growing season will be a much more effective and sustainable long-term solution. So, thank you for your time and attention, and I wish each of you a very safe and very prosperous 2021 growing season.
Hello everybody, my name is Kevin Bradley and I'm the State Extension Weed Scientist at the University of Missouri. Valent asked me to talk a little bit about the importance of pre-emergence residual herbicides in our soybean production systems. And I'm glad to do that because I think they are the most important herbicide pass that we're going to make throughout the season. The reason for me saying that is basically twofold. First, I believe that we need effective pre-emergence residual herbicides because of the resistant weeds that we're seeing. And specifically, I'm talking about Waterhemp and Palmer amaranth. Those two weeds are the worst weeds that we have right now in U.S. agriculture and are causing all kinds of problems. In our state alone, it's pretty typical that we're spraying water hemp that has 4, 5, and even 6-way resistance. And in the United States as a whole, water hemp over the years has evolved resistance to 7 different herbicide modes of action. So that's just phenomenal, and just another reason that we need pre-emergence residual herbicides that incorporate multiple modes of action into the whole system. The second reason I'd say we need pre-emergence residual herbicides is pretty simple. It's yield protection. I know many of you have heard this over the years, but it is true, and that is that weeds cause the most yield loss early in the season. Another way to say it is soybeans are most susceptible when they're emerging through that soil and in those early parts of the season. And so if we want to get the most yield that we can get, we need to apply a pre-emergence residual herbicide. So no matter whether it's from the standpoint of resistant weed management or resistant weed mitigation or yield protection, I do believe that pre-emergence residual herbicides are the most important herbicide pass that we're going to make during the year. And that's regardless of what system we're in, what trait, whether it's Liberty Link, Roundup Ready, Extend Flex, or Enlist. And the last thing I would say is I wouldn't consider myself a decent weed scientist without adding that I'd encourage you to incorporate as many cultural weed management practices into your overall weed management system as possible. Of course, that's with herbicides, but putting those two things together is going to make your weed management program the most sustainable for the longest period of time. Thanks, and hope you all have a good day.
Hello, my name is Brian Young. I'm a professor of weed science at Purdue University, and I'd just like to take a moment to talk with you a little bit about soil residual herbicides and the value of those in a good weed management program. You've probably heard about the benefits of overall resistance management, widening the application window for post-emergence herbicides, and also maybe protecting crop yield by preventing early season weed competition. The one I want to focus in a little bit more is herbicide resistance. If we look at all the major weed species we've had problems with in terms of resistance over the last 20 years, it's all what we would call low-level resistance and primarily to post-emergence herbicides. So that's where a lot of our problems are occurring. So why is that? Well, when you think about a post-application, we're applying a high enough dose to kill the weeds that are present and really not applying much higher than the rate necessary to kill it. That'd be wasteful. But from a resistance management standpoint, that's important because any mechanism that allows that weed to survive the 1x rate is now in play. It could be a low-level resistance, but it can survive and develop into resistance issue. If we look at the soil residual herbicides, it's a little bit different. In the first week of application, you might have 20 times the herbicide concentration in that soil to control those weeds. So kind of like killing it 20 times over. Week 2 or 3, maybe you have 10x of the rate necessary to kill those weeds. Maybe in week 4 or week 5, you're down to maybe the 1 to 2x rate, and you might start to see some escapes. But the main point is there's a lot less of an opportunity for weeds to evolve resistance mechanisms when you have such a high concentration being exposed to those weeds, okay, in that soil application. So using soil residual herbicides selects primarily for some high-level resistance mechanisms. Using post herbicides, we select for all resistance mechanisms. And that's why I prefer, starting with the sound residual herbicide program to help reduce the risk of some of these various low-level resistance mechanisms evolving in our fields today. Thank you for your time.
So those were great comments by some of the leading Midwest weed scientists, and appreciate getting their perspective on managing resistance and the importance of using pre-emergence herbicides and just a general integrated approach to mitigating and preventing or slowing further resistance development. So now we're going to talk about managing resistance in an Auxin traded system from a valent standpoint. And the first thing we'll look at here is just a general status on herbicide, unique cases of herbicide resistance reported. And you can see the trend lines really started going up in the late 80s, early 90s. And most of our row crops are the situations where resistance has been reported most widely. Wheat leads the way. Resistant weeds in corn follows, while soybeans and rice follow corn close behind there. In terms of what sites of action have the most documented cases over time, you can see the highest amount are the group 2 or ALS, or herbicides in the ALS family. Followed by group 5, which includes things like atrazine and metribuzin, followed third by ACCase herbicides. That would be your grass killers such as Select or Fusilate or any of the graminicides. So the Auxin technologies in soybeans are obviously new, but we've used those herbicides for a long time. 2,4-D tolerant soybeans have been introduced to the marketplace, as well as dicamba tolerant soybeans. And, we should really take care or learn lessons from the past in terms of if we use them in the same type of way that we used glyphosate after the introduction of glyphosate-resistant crops. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that we'll select and push the weed populations to select for individuals that are at least tolerant, if not resistant, to the Auxin technologies. And there's been a couple of documented cases where we've seen where dicamba resistance has been documented in kochia after repeated uses. There's actually been a Waterhemp population that was documented to be resistant to 2,4-D, and again, that situation was a situation outside of corn and soybeans, but the general principles in terms of continuous selection pressure, applications made every single year for control were the background in terms of selecting for resistance. So while obviously not widespread, it's important to note that the general principles, resistance has been selected or it's been shown possible through repeated applications. So to start here and kind of re-emphasize what some of the university folks talk about in integrated weed management, we want to talk about principles of resistant weed management and talk about some of the aspects that are important to keep in mind. So for adopting an integrated approach, I like to think about three areas or three, phases to keep in mind to think about to prevent resistance. So the first area is weed biology. So it's really important to know the species that are in your field that you're trying to manage, and then knowing a little bit about them. For example, when do they come up during the season? When they do come up, how fast do they grow? How early do they come or emerge? How late do they emerge? All those have an impact on the types of tools that we should select or implement to not only get good weed control, but use multiple tactics to make sure we aren't using one herbicide or one repeated application time over time to achieve control. Integrating cultural practices such as tillage, cover crops have become quite prevalent in extension meetings and in the agricultural press. And still keeping in mind traditional things like a solid crop rotation, and then how you manage the crop in terms of like row spacing, things like that. Those cultural practices are really important in terms of keeping weed populations off balance and doing everything we can to prevent all the load being carried by a single herbicide or a single herbicide application. And then the third thing is what is your herbicide program? Most row crop, corn, soybean, wheat grown in the United States are still going to use and utilize herbicides for their primary mode of weed control. And then within that, within thinking about how you implement a herbicide program, there's a number of important things to keep in mind. Those being using multiple effective sites of action where that's possible. So tank mixing or using premixes that have two or more sites of action that are effective on the weed species present. Rotation of herbicide modes of action can be helpful. Obviously not a silver bullet, but slowing down or not implementing the same thing over and over does help. Increasingly, timely applications are important. The smaller the weeds, the easier they are to control, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a couple slides. And then something that's become, I guess, more popular in the last couple of years as we've seen Palmer amaranth and Waterhemp increase in prevalence is thinking about using an in-crop or overlapping residual to keep those weed populations down. And then, as always, using full rates, and we'll talk about full rates in the context of residuals here in a little bit. So knowing a little bit about the biology of the weeds that you have in your field, most growers will have a couple really problematic species in a field, and in a lot of cases we're talking about Waterhemp or Palmer amaranth, but in different geographies you might be talking about kochia or mare's tail or giant ragweed as well. Those are some of the big ones that have documented resistance that present a challenge to growers. And I like to use this slide. This is the emergence periodicity or the emergence window for a number of really common agricultural weeds. And designing a weed control program is not necessarily the easiest thing, because you have weeds that might come up real early in the season versus Palmer amaranth or morning glories or something like that tend to come up very, very late. So a lot of practical decisions need to get made that the biology of the weed will also affect. So this is an overlay I like to use, and we'll just talk about it in terms of the emergence window of common water hemp. So from a practical standpoint, if a grower chooses to use a Preemergence herbicide that provides, say, they choose a product or a rate of a product that provides 3 to 4 weeks of control. The first red box on the screen shows that, in this idealized situation, you might cover 25-30% of that emergence window. Whereas if you make a different choice on a pre-emergence product that, say, gives you 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks of weed control, you can see that we cover a much larger portion of that water hemp emergence window there. So the practical decisions that growers make when selecting a pre-emergence herbicide, and then when they apply that, can have a real effect on how you alter the amaranth or any weed population during the growing season. And what our goal should be is to cover as much of the emergence window as possible with a pre-emergence herbicide in order to lessen the selection pressure or the number of individuals that the post-emergence application needs to control. So not all weeds come up in the spring. Where there's much less tillage. Things like mare's tail or henbit or some of our winter annual weeds will typically be a problem. And just knowing when those emerge, in particular, mare's tail, I think tends to be one of the ones that is most problematic from a winter annual standpoint. And then targeting applications that are going to be more effective on that weed species may be the best choice a grower can make. So this example right here is some spring germinated on the left versus fall germinated on the right, mare's tail. And you can see that the mare's tail on the right has a much larger root system. Even though it doesn't look that much different on the top, you know, that plant germinated last fall and survived over the winter, and is going to be much more difficult to control in the spring than it is in the fall. And that's why knowing the biology of the weed and looking at something like a fall application can be quite effective when you put that into practice. So you can see on the left here are some soybeans that had a lot of mare's tail and kochia in there. On the left is an application that was made without residual, and then on the right is an application, a fall application that was made with residual. And you can see how the burn down the residual make a big difference. And that is all about using the biology of the weed and timing that application to the best time to be most effective on that weed species. In the next slide, we'll talk about the importance of timely applications. A strong pre-emergence program is important to give growers a window to make more timely post-emergence applications. Waterhemp and Palmer amaranth, once we get into the warmer part of the season, can grow very quickly. This is just a growth rate graph from University of Missouri, just demonstrating that under optimal conditions, Palmer amaranth can grow 1 to 2 inches a day. Waterhemp can grow nearly an inch a day out there. So, that can pose a challenge for making very timely post-emergence applications, and using a pre-emergence program can widen out that window and help with the timeliness of post-emergence applications. And when we're talking about resistance, the size of the weeds is key. Even on this 2-inch tall waterhemp here, we can see count 9 nodes, and if the plant isn't controlled, it will typically grow back from one of the growing points or nodes that wasn't killed. So that's already a lot of potential regrowth on a 2-inch tall plant. If we wait till the plant doubles in size, or we get to a 5 to 6 inch tall plant, we can see that number of growing points increases to 22. So those numbers increase very, very quickly, and being timely is really important. And that just drives home the message that controlling weeds before they as they come out of the ground, when there's basically a single growing point, is the strength of pre-emergence herbicides. It controls weeds when they're very, very young and they never get going. Other cultural factors that are good to incorporate into a overall weed resistance management or weed control program, if it fits the situation, is things like tillage. Obviously, it's a non-herbicide way to control weeds, but there are obviously downsides to that, or implementing tillage as well, including potential for wind and water erosion and loss of soil. Cover crops are another, topic that has been on the forefront of folks' minds here. Garnered a lot of thought and research in the last few years, and it's part of using many tools to suppress weeds, and I think this is a really interesting area that we have a lot to learn about in terms of incorporating both cover crops and pre-emergence herbicides effectively into a overall weed management program to basically use as many tools and add non-chemical tools to improve waterhemp and Palmer amaranth control and other weeds as well. Cover crops are really good at suppressing winter annual weeds like mare's tail, and they help prevent soil erosion. So those are all positive aspects of implementing cover crops in addition to the weed control that they can provide, or suppression that they can provide. The last cultural thing I'll talk about is row spacing. Just thinking about row spacing in soybeans can have a real impact on the weed-free period necessary in soybeans to maintain maximum yield. And you can see from this graph that in 30-inch rows, we start losing yield to early season weed competition much sooner and at a little quicker rate as compared to more narrow rows. So for growers that choose to use wider rows or 30-inch rows or wider, using pre-emergence herbicides to start that crop off weed-free is a really important choice to make when it comes to realizing or maximizing full yield potential of that soybean crop. So now we'll transition into talking about herbicide programs. Like I said earlier, the primary tool that growers do use for weed control is herbicides in the Midwest. Incorporating the cultural factors and non-chemical factors are always important, but the overall herbicide program itself we need to think about and pay some attention to. And I like this graph from a paper from the University of Illinois. It demonstrates that they did some work looking at glyphosate resistance in waterhemp seed from farmers' fields in Illinois, and they were able to obtain herbicide history on these fields, and it's really interesting that growers that implemented tank mixtures when they applied herbicides or multiple modes of action in an application when they applied herbicides were much much less likely to have water or glyphosate resistance in the seed 5 to 6 years later. So I think it's a really good starting point to start talking about mixtures of herbicides, both in the pre-emergence and post-emergence applications. In the last section of this presentation, we'll talk about using and building an effective pre-program and why that's important in an overall weed management program. So the objective we're trying to achieve with a pre-emergence herbicide is one start the crop off weed-free to maintain maximum yield potential, and then 2 on these problematic weed species provide as much residual control as possible to lessen the load or the selection pressure on the post-emergence application. And what that does is fewer individuals exposed to the post-emergence application reduces the overall selection pressure, and hopefully that will extend the life and utility of new technologies we bring into the soybean weed control management world. So this is a stylized graph overlaying Waterhemp emergence over time, and we have a hypothetical effective residual dose here. So when we apply a Preemergence herbicide, the initial dose is very effective on weed control, and over time that dose will dissipate in the soil, break down in the soil, and get to a point where the water hemp in this case can start to germinate and emerge. And the goal of that application is to again prevent as much early emergence as possible. Now the green line here represents a full rate of a herbicide, a residual herbicide. Some of the practical decisions that farmers make is on cost and rate selection of herbicides. And if folks choose to go with a lower rate, you can see initially that the black line that came up on the graph, initially that dose is very effective, but you get to the point quicker where it becomes or degrades quicker to the point where water hemp starts emerging earlier. So that's the kind of the balance that folks run on selecting rate, and that's why recommendation of using full rates of pre's is one of the, I guess, keystones to helping manage resistance. Full rates control more individuals for a longer period of time. And hopefully the goal here is in a soybean crop, we get to close to canopy, preventing weeds from germinating, and then there's a very small amount of weed pressure that needs to be controlled post-emergence. I really like this graph generated from the University of Wisconsin, and we'll focus on the graph on the right. This is residual water hemp control 50 days after application, and a lot of times universities will do very large product comparisons, and they took an interesting way of looking at this. They analyzed the data just by rather than the individual products, they lumped all the products together based on the number of modes of action in the product. And you can see the regression, the blue regression line here. Obviously 0 is your untreated control, and products that contain one mode of action, you had about a 30% probability of having 90% weed control 50 days after application. But when you went to a dual mode of action product, that likelihood of having 90% control increased to about 75%. And when you lumped all the data together for 3 mode of action products, your likelihood of having 90% control 50 days after application was about 90%. And this just reinforces the message that a strong pre, particularly ones that contain a group 14 and a group 15 together, are really important component of a strong residual program. There's some nuance and some caveat around this data, primarily being, some of the two mode of actions contain ALS herbicides, and those are not necessarily or may not be effective on water hemp. So there's some nuance that has to be taken with this graph. But I think the message here is really, really good in terms of multiple mode of action, multiple effective mode of action, really does, in a pre-emergence product, really does as good a job as we can do in terms of overall residual control and helping reduce selection pressure on the post-emergence application. So now we'll talk about the flumioxazin brand ladder and why Fierce products fit into the overall pre-emergence management program as one of the best options for Palmer amaranth and water hemp control on the market today. So our flumioxazin-based products start with Valor and Valor XLT, and then we move into the Fierce line of products, Fierce XLT, and Fierce MTZ. Valor itself is flumioxazin alone, group 14 pre-emergence herbicide, providing one mode of action on water hemp and Palmer amaranth control. We talk about that at a full rate, providing 4 to 5 weeks of residual, good residual control. Valor XLT adds large seeded broadleaf control and brings another mode of action for overall management, but we still talk about flumioxazin in Valor XLT as the primary mode of action, doing control of water hemp and Palmer amaranth. And this is where we think Fierce really plays a nice role or nice fit in the pre-emergence area. Fierce has two modes of action, group 14 and a group 15 together. Flumioxazin and pyroxasulfone. The pyroxasulfone adds additional grass control, and we have two effective modes of action on water hemp and Palmer amaranth, and it extends out the residual control up to 7 to 8 weeks, depending upon the rate that growers choose to use. Fierce XLT adds a third mode of action, but the third mode of action primarily expands the overall control to include large seeded broadleaves for growers that have giant ragweed issues or heavy sunflower issues. That can be a really good choice for their pre-emergence program. But again, we still have two effective modes of action on water hemp and Palmer amaranth, and a very long residual window of control. And the third option that growers have is Fierce MTZ, which adds an additional third mode of action, metribuzin, on water hemp and Palmer amaranth, and we still get a very long window of weed control and very broad spectrum as well. So fitting into the overall weed management program, the pre-emergence is only one component of an overall weed emergence program, but in terms of long-term sustainability and the way growers manage weeds today, it's probably the most important piece or decision that growers make in terms of their overall weed control program. And the Fierce line of herbicides brings a lot to the table in that area. And again, this goes back to kind of re-emphasizing the biology of the weed. If the choice you make on a pre-emergence product, for be it rate, be it product choice, only gives you about 4 weeks of residual control. You can see, that window might cover some species, but when you get to a late emerging species like water hemp, we're just touching on the first part of the emergence window, leaving a great or a higher amount of pressure for the post-emergence application to control. Whereas if you make a different choice on a more premium soil pre-emergence product in soybeans, there is a real difference in terms of getting 6 to 8 weeks of weed control and doing a much better job of covering that water hemp or Palmer amaranth emergence window and lessening the pressure, the overall pressure on the post-emergence application. Now, some growers are facing extremely high pressure from Palmer amaranth or water hemp, or they're in 30-inch or maybe even wider than 30-inch rows. And particularly if you're further south where you have a little longer growing season, a pre-emergence herbicide is an important foundation, but it's not necessarily will cover the whole window. And for growers that are still wanting an in-season residual, that might be a necessary component to keep high pressures of Palmer amaranth and water hemp under control. So that's a very fast growing area of the soybean weed control market. And this is for valent, from a valent perspective, this is where Perpetual comes into the picture. And for growers that are wanting a strong pre-emergence option, they can choose one of the Fierce products. But then if they want to extend residual, they have a choice of using a product like Perpetual. And Valent has a whole nother presentation on this new option for growers. So I'm not going to talk about that very much in this presentation. Just to note that growers that want additional in-season residual, we have a new option for them to utilize. So to summarize, I hope folks are taking away that an integrated approach to weed management is incredibly important, and implementing a strong pre-emergence choice such as the Fierce line of products, in addition to all the other cultural things that are important for overall good weed management and resistance management, has come across here. And the importance of selecting a pre-emergence herbicide that gives you the longest amount of residual control is one of the ways to keep the utility of some of the new technologies, post-emergence technologies that we now have useful for a longer period of time. So I'd like to just thank our university specialists again for their comments up front and their perspective on resistance management and weed control here in the Midwest, and like to wish everybody a successful 2021 growing season, and hope you have a great time at the Commodity Classic. Thanks.